Hello everyone, this is Stuart, your Vice Captain speaking, and thank you for flying with us today. We're going to be tying a Roy Christie BWO or blue-winged olive. Now there are 4 things about this fly that are very different. Number 1, you tie it backwards with the tail at the eye of the hook and the hackle at the hook bend. Number 2, you tie the hackle using the Paraloop method, which means, number 3, that the eye of the hook and your tippet is always buried underwater and the trout can't see it. And number 4, the hook bend and the hook point are hidden above the water or in the water film, and again, the trout can't see it. So this is a very stealthy fly. It's like nothing else most fishermen will have in their box, and you often get a take very first cast. It's a real blank buster. But it is a little bit of a challenge to tie. Not because the fly is difficult, it's actually quite easy, but because the first time you tie it, you realise you have to tie everything backwards from every fly that you've ever been taught before, and you have to work against your muscle memory, and you probably need to try 2 or 3 times before you start to get it right. But once you do, you will have a unique and special fly that's a real blank buster and virtually no other fisherman will have. Our hook today will be a Teamco TMC 206BL, barbless to protect the fish and black to help the stealth of the fly. I like this hook because for its length it has a wide gape and it does a good job of holding fish. Our thread today will be a Reverse 12O in olive. Tie on opposite the hook point and work your way backwards to around about the 10 o'clock position. Wind back to the tying in point in open turns and then use touching turns forward to the eye of the hook, laying a bed of thread as you go. Our next ingredient is teal flank. Choose a finely marked feather. Align the fibres at 90 degrees to align the fibre tips and then tear off. Swap the fibres to your other hand and tie in about half a shank length over the hook eye. And you'll see here that the fine markings do a fine job of looking like the original nymph. Then remove the waste, being careful to leave as little as possible. Take some old tippet, around about 5 pounds breaking strain, and cut off around about 10 inches, and then run this through your fingers several times to straighten it. Having done this, then tie the tippet in on top of the hook, making sure that you leave about 3 inches hanging over the front and around about 6 inches hanging over the back of the hook. Now wrap back in touching turns. You want to wrap to where the hook bend is around about 30 degrees off vertical. Then grab the tailing 6 inches and form a loop. I usually do this in front, and then tie the loop in. Do a couple of wraps behind, and then pull the tippet end to make the loop relatively small. This makes tying the rest of the fly easier. And then carry on wrapping down back to the 10 o'clock position, and then come back past the loop. At this point, I'll usually stop and put the tippet end into the material holder spring to get it out of the way. Our next material is a whiting dry fly hackle in dun. I'll usually choose the same size of the hook or go up one size in rough water. Cut away the feather waste and then form a ladder anchor point, as this helps tie in firmly, because you're going to pull on this when you do the paraloop. Don't try and do it with a bare stem. Tie this in just below the paraloop and use a figure-8 wrap to help the feather stick out up into the loop, first in front and then behind, bringing the feather back to a position at the centre of the loop. Once the feather is secured, a few more wraps will make sure that the waist stem is bound in the thorax area and add some thickness there. Now wind forward in open turns to minimise the thickness of the nymph body up to the hook eye itself. At this point, I'll invert the fly to make dubbing easier. It keeps your fingers away from the sharp hook point. I'll use a superfine dubbing in blue winged olive. Wax the thread as usual. I use a load of old cobbler's wax. Now form a dubbing noodle as usual, thinner at the top, thicker at the bottom, to allow you to form a conical body. However, having done this, you then wind backwards rather than forwards to form that conical body, so that works a little bit against your muscle memory. Finish the dubbed body opposite the hook point. Then take the 3 inches of tippet at the front, insert it in your hackle pliers, and then use this to rib the body backwards 8 or 10 times. A nymph usually has 8 or 10 body segments, so it's much more realistic to do it more than the 5 as usual. Then pick up your thread and lock the rib and remove the waist. When you remove the waist, always move it above the hook to cut. That stops you cutting your thread by mistake. Dubbing is now complete, so you can turn the fly right side up. I see I've left a little bit of monofilament protruding there, so I'm just going to take it away. Next, take a good quality peacock eye, pull out a strand, snap it away from the peacock eye, grip the thick end in one finger and thumb and run it through your other finger and thumb to break away the fragile tip which should be discarded. Reverse the hurl to your other hand and then tie in the tip where you've just broken off the fragile bit in at the thorax. Having done this, you want to then run your thread to the back of the fly, but this is going to feel awkward because you're going to have to lift it past the loop and the feather and the hurl to get back to the 10 o'clock position. Having done this, take the peacock hurl and wrap it to form the thorax. Use more than one layer if needed to give you a nice thick thorax, and use a figure of 8 around the loop itself to make sure that you get good coverage of the hook bend by and underneath the loop. Having done this, then take the hurl down to the 10 o'clock position, cross your thread, lock it off with your thread 2 or 3 turns, make sure you hold the thread tight, and then you can simply snap the peacock hurl off. Right, now it's time to pay some attention to the paraloop itself. This is probably the most important new trick to learn. Open the loop again with your left fingers and the bodkin in your right hand. You should find that the front of the loop is still enables you to pull through some tippet from the back. You did have 6 inches there. Pull around about 5 inches through, leaving 1 inch only at the back of the fly. Having done this, you want to transfer the loop from your left hand where it is now to your right hand. On your right hand, use your pinky and ring finger to hold the loop up and tight and apart, and then use your left finger and thumb to maneuver the feather through and round the forward piece of the loop, swapping between the thumb and forefingers of left hand and right hand. You're going to need to have 8 or 10 turns because the tippet is around about half the thickness of a hook and therefore needs twice the turns. Having done this, hold tight with both hands, pinch the top of the hackle and slide it down to the thorax and hold. Release with your right hand, make sure the loop is free, and then grab that 1 inch of tippet at the back and pull through that 5 inches that you just pulled through before, and then tug hard to lock the hackle down and in place on top of the thorax, and then give the fly a primp. If any fibres get trapped in the loop, just use your bodkin to release them from the loop itself. You then tug hard once more to make everything secure, and then use your scissors in a push method to remove first the tippet and then the feather. Don't cut or you'll damage the hackle itself. The final step, as usual, is to put in a whip finish. I use a large whip finisher here so that I can reach the back of the fly. You usually put in 1 4 or 5 turn whip finish or 2 smaller ones just to make sure that the fly is well held. When you cut the thread, use an open blade and just push against the thread so that only the thread under the tension is cut, and this protects your hackle. I'm now just going to adjust the fly in the vise so that you can actually see how it floats. So first of all, it floats from the hackle. The thorax appears just in the water film. This is the body and the tail of the nymph, which is now nicely marked. When you attach the fishing line, it's now hidden in the tails and it's buried under the water and can't be seen.